Hello and a very warm welcome to the McGregor Healthcare Q4 webinar. High volume irrigation, a retrospective and futurespective. My name is Bridget Collins and I'm the Global Clinical Education Manager for McGregor Healthcare. And I'm also here with our newly appointed Clinical Education Manager, Michelle Henderson.
Thanks, Bridget. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. We are coming to you today from Loch Lomond with its magnificent panoramic views over the loch. It looks and feels very beautiful indeed.
Today on our agenda, we've got some terrific guest speakers who will help us to take a look back and also look forward at high volume irrigation. We'll cover recent research and also call upon the expertise of our speakers who all have different roles within this specialist area.
What if I told you we had something very special, something very new to show you? Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to you later with that.
In 2021, there were approximately 2.34 million high volume irrigations within the UK. This means that every day there are about 6,500 patients who do a high volume irrigation.
I'm sure our next guest speaker would be very impressed with those statistics. Let's go and have a chat with him. Hi Peter, thank you very much for joining us today. What are your thoughts on how irrigation all began?
Transanal irrigation began at our unit from inspiration from the urologists. They treated patients with and children with spina bifida with transanal irrigation. And we thought that why not use this treatment for adult patients as well? Both with adult patients with spina bifida, but also neurogenic bowel dysfunction patients, spinal cord injury patients, and MS patients. And why not also try to look into if it could be of use for a more heterogeneous background, for more functional patients. And we built up some expertise and we're able to kind of make proof of principle that this therapy works also for adult patients. For some patients, it worked better. For other patients, it might not work that good. And we continue this process, trying to raise the evidence for this treatment, aiming to show or come up with the final proof of transanal irrigation for the neurogenic bowel dysfunction group of patients with the 2006 randomized controlled trial, where we actually made the final proof that transanal irrigation for neurogenic bowel dysfunction patients were superior to best conservative treatment. And this still stands as a very strong evidence that there should be a place for transanal irrigation in treating patients.
So I guess, Peter, if you hadn't have used irrigation, we wouldn't be where we're at now. So we've all been inspired by you to use irrigation and add that into a treatment box. So that means we've got more options and more treatment options for patients to use. When you started using irrigation, what did you think the possibilities would be for the use of irrigation?
The possibilities were unlimited to the beginning. I thought this was the treatment of truth for every functional bowel patient. But of course, I got more experienced and saw a lot of other patients and find out that the treatment from time to time are troublesome. Is troublesome. Some patients reacted better than others did. And some patients struggle a lot with the equipment at those times. In the beginning, we actually used a more or less homemade system, but luckily we have seen the industry come up with different product lines. So we have products with a balloon, without a balloon, with gravity driven, with pump driven, with mechanical pumps. And now we are able to find or limit the practical issues for having this treatment to work. And then it comes back to us as clinicians to be able to find and select the right patients for the treatment. It's not only about having the right indication, but you should also have the right patient. You have the right patient with the right motivation to do this, because this is something the patients need to accept, that this will be a part of their lives, their body, to help them live more or less a normal life with their bowel dysfunction. And this is a difficult process.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Peter. And I guess we've learned an awful lot in the last decade about transanal irrigation, but there is an awful lot more to learn. And I guess that means continuing the research, but perhaps in a very different way. But I do see that irrigation can be taken into the future arena, perhaps with the research in a slightly different way to what we've seen in the past.
We still need to raise the evidence level for the treatment of other indications like the neurogenic bowel dysfunction. Emerging areas would be low anti-resection syndrome, where the treatment I have the feeling that the treatment spreads quite fast for now, and also there might be possibilities to extend the treatment in functional bowel patients as well. But again, we need to raise evidence at those indications. And we need also to understand more about the mechanism of actions. Is this only a mechanical cleansing due to the water effect and the water column effect to the rectus sigmoid, or would there be any effects higher up in the colon, and perhaps treating the constipation? Could you then also increase or decrease the effects on small bowel motility and gastric emptying? So we need to look into why this works, and also, of course, why it from time to time does not work.
Yes, Peter, I think that's absolutely right. And I hope that's something that you're going to do and share with us in the future. I think we could all learn from the information that you provide. We'd like to say a real big thank you for joining us today and your contribution to this webinar. Thank you so much, Peter.
My pleasure.
Hi, Alice. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and what a beautiful setting.
Absolutely. And well done on a fantastic publication in gastrointestinal nursing. Alice, when I first met you a few years ago at St Peter's in Chertsey, you were quite new to high volume irrigation. And yet here you are, having published a service audit. What led you into doing a service audit?
I think, you know, an audit is always worthwhile doing, whatever you achieve from it, whether it being assessing the service that you're providing to patients. I think, as you say, I was new to it. So it's also assessing myself, my own ability. And it's great to speak to the patients, you know, firsthand, even though we do follow-ups and over the telephone and face-to-face, having that rigid structure of like a questionnaire, speaking to them, asking everyone the same questions, you really get an understanding of, you know, how the patients are doing, and are they finding it effective? Do they still use it? Because sometimes, you know, you send patients off, you know, with this device, and, you know, they feel like they're on their own maybe, and it's nice that we speak to them in this audit and we understand exactly what's going on with them. I think, you know, furthermore as well, with an audit, you know, hopefully you'll get something out of it. So some sort of evidence, data that you can then do statistical analysis on. And with that, I think it's really powerful when you're in an MDT or you're trying to justify prescribing this device to your CCG or the GPs, and having that evidence there that you get from an audit can't really dispute it once it's there.
I agree. And I think in this current climate in the NHS, it's absolutely crucial, isn't it, to be able to justify services and show effectiveness and efficientness of your clinics. So, and you were talking about from the patient's perspective of the audit. How did that go with, what did you find out from them?
I think, well, it was a mixed bag, really. It was, some people, they get on with it so well, they find it completely life-changing, which is always so great to hear.
Yeah.
Some people, they feel like they need a bit more help, they need a bit more guidance. And that was great because we were able to bring people back in and then give them a bit more training, try and reassure them. I think as well, showing the patients that we're doing an audit really proves to them that we're not just giving them an advice and sending them their way, and then they then have to just cope with it and, goodbye, you're off. And it's not, we're constantly following them up, making sure they're okay. Because ultimately we all have the same goal. We want to improve patient care and make these people's lives a little less burdensome from their functional bowel disorder.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess with the data that you have, because it showed that you had a reduction in laxatives, was it 47% reduction in the use of laxatives, which is amazing, really amazing. So I guess the data that you've got in that publication is going to be really helpful for healthcare professionals. Do you think it might help for people to deliver new services, improve their own services?
I think so. Well, I hope so as well. I think, we're a district hospital. I think it goes to show that you don't have to be a specialist unit or a tertiary centre to provide this service to patients. And the fact that it does reduce laxative usage as well is a great, feat kind of thing.
Yes.
And because we all know laxatives, it's, compliance and adherence is really, really difficult. People usually stop using them. There's so many different laxatives on the market. Which one do you use? It's quite confusing. And using these different sorts of laxatives is very disruptive. It can really affect your day-to-day life. You don't know when they're going to start to take effect. Are you going to be out in the shop? That's what, and people end up staying inside, and that's not what we want to promote. We want people to have confidence to go out and do their normal life and not be restricted.
Exactly. And I suppose with irrigation, you kind of know when you're going to use it, you're going to be safe when you go out because it's predictable sort of bowel routine.
Exactly. It's you taking control of your bowels rather than your bowels controlling you.
Yes, exactly. I really like the publication, and I think it's going to really help healthcare professionals in developing services, in justifying services. So thank you so much for it. I think it's going to be very, very helpful for a lot of people. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you here.
No, thank you. As I said, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much to Alice. I'd now like to introduce you to our next guest speaker, who is Lucy Allen, physiotherapist in bowel dysfunction. Welcome, Lucy. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
I had the pleasure of working with you at St Mark's Hospital, where you had your own caseload of patients using high-volume irrigation as an adjunct to conservative therapies. And I now know that you've got your own business and you're doing the same thing. How did you manage to introduce high-volume irrigation into that setup of that business?
Well, I think when I started at St Mark's, I hadn't had any prior practical sort of experience of using high or low volume irrigation, just because of the role and sort of setting that I was in. So starting at St Mark's, because our roles there were very much a blend of nursing and physio skills, it was very much sort of extending that scope of practice, which included irrigation. I was able to have the caseload through to be able to use irrigation on those patients, but also get the teaching and the training to be able to know when it was appropriate to use it. So I think having access to that experience, it's then been quite a nice transition into sort of a private practice setting, being able to take the decision guide and that reasoning process with me for the patients that I get through now.
Right.
That I can now offer high volume irrigation in that setting as well.
Yeah. So you were saying about there were a blurring of the roles in nursing and physio. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
So I think sort of traditionally, from a physiotherapy point of view, we never really have access to irrigation to be able to offer that to patients. It was always sort of something you would refer out of the service for.
Right.
So I think being able to gain experience from a nursing point of view in some of the physio skills and a physio point of view in some of the nursing skills to offer your patients the whole package in one place really makes a big difference to their care. So from an irrigation point of view, being able to have the knowledge and skills to offer that in that appointment and for them to then be able to take that away and start is hugely valuable.
So what you did at St Mark's, you replicated into your business that you've set up now?
Yes, I mean, the types of patients and conditions that I see in private practice is very much the same. So you'll have patients through who might have slow transit constipation, who have been on a range of different laxative regimes, but are still struggling to empty the bowel. So using high volume irrigation with those patients and being able to offer that in clinic has been incredibly helpful. But also for those patients that have slow transit constipation, but also obstructive defecation, I will also use the irrigation from a transit point of view, whilst we're trying to work on the pelvic floor dyssynergia and improve the outlet problem.
Yeah.
But they're still able to empty their bowels regularly. So it also helps sort of along the rehabilitation process as well.
So how would somebody go about setting up their own service?
I think to begin with, it's about ensuring you've established those connections and networks with your referring consultants and other team members and departments that would have those patients through. But also everyone being aware of the skills and the type of service you're actually able to offer those patients to begin with. And then I think once the patients start coming through, using the decision guide to help you sort of reason through what type of irrigation to be using with the patient, when that high volume irrigation is going to be best, really helps you ensure that you're providing the right thing for the patient at the right time. It's really about ensuring that you have, I think, the skills and expertise to know when to bring in the irrigation. So trying to get access to teaching and education around irrigation and around all the different types of bowel dysfunction that patients might present with. So there are courses available that help you gain that practical experience of the high volume irrigation, but also talking through and reasoning through different types of patient scenarios of what treatment methods would be best for those patients and when high volume irrigation can be a really useful tool for that.
I agree, Lucy. I think courses are able to set the foundation for both nurses and physios in being able to treat patients with bowel dysfunction. And I also think that having experts on a webinar like this can help people to learn and gain knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for coming in today. Really appreciate your help and expertise.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to now introduce you to our next guest speakers who will have a discussion around the complex needs of patients using high volume irrigation. Michelle and I are here with two clinical nurse specialists on the sofa. We have Rebecca Embleton, bowel dysfunction nurse at Durham. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. What a gorgeous place. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. And we also have Jane Stanbridge, neurogenic specialist nurse, formerly at the National Spinal Injuries Centre at Stoke Mandeville, and now having set up your own business of JPEL Training Limited.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us both today. I know that you've both have very well established clinics, and especially in using transanal irrigation, but with differing bowel etiologies. Rebecca, if I could come to you first, I know that you have referrals sent to you each day in your clinics. I wonder if you could give me an overview of how that patient starts within your clinic.
Yes, we would bring them into clinic and we would assess them. And we would look at what their current symptom pattern was at that time. And we would sort of take a full history. And we tend to start with our constipation pathway. We would work on lifestyle measures first. So we would look at diet, fluids, exercise, all the sort of basic things that we need to get into place before we start working on anything more involved. So an example of a patient we would get in, maybe a 40-year-old lady who's had a 5-year history of constipation. She's tried all standard laxative. She comes to us, we assess her, go through all of the standard lifestyle measures, and we would usually then start a sort of second line laxative, such as like prucalopride. We would try that for 4 weeks. Then the patient would come back to us and have a transit study. And if we then diagnosed slow transit constipation, the next step for us would be to look at transanal irrigation. That would be the next step in our pathway.
Okay, so when you talk about next treatment options, what sort of length of time is that from when they come to you to when they get into having the transit study?
Yeah, so usually on the first appointment we would start them on a second line laxative for about 4 weeks to see whether they had any benefit from it.
Yeah.
And if they hadn't, that's when we would get them back in and we would look at irrigation next.
And so that's, how many weeks roughly would that be between then and, you're talking about 4 weeks for trying the laxative?
Yeah.
And is it just that 4 weeks?
Yeah, if they've had a good result from the laxative, then that's great. If they haven't, then we would look to, if we've tried sort of oral methods of treating the constipation, we would look at rectal methods. So we would look onto potentially using suppositories, potentially using transanal irrigation.
So you actually use transanal irrigation and introduce it quite early on in your pathway?
Yeah, we tend to find that patients have had their constipation for a very long period of time before they get to us. And they've usually gone through months, if not years and years, of different medications and still aren't finding any benefit. So it's in their interest that if we have tried something for 4 weeks and it's not working, we just move on to something that might work better for them.
Yes, very much so. And Jane, I know you've had a big caseload of spinal cord injured patients when you were at Stoke Mandeville. Is that the same sort of pattern for the spinal cord injured patients, that sort of pathway?
It's a very interesting listing, actually, because having been immersed in spinal injuries for so long, in actual fact, to talk about other bowel disorders, dysfunctions is quite interesting. So I guess what we would call it is we focus on the conservative bowel management first, which is, as you were saying, the lifestyle choices, diet, exercise, oral and rectal medications, and then that's when we would like to fine-tune that first, just to make sure. So this sounded, I'm sitting here nodding next to you because I was really pleased to hear that actually we're obviously all talking off the same sheet, and that's really reassuring. And a bit like you, it may well be that we have someone come to clinic or someone I'm dealing with privately that has been dealing with this problem for so long. So why would we keep them waiting longer?
Yes.
But it's about demonstrating that. But equally, I've had lots of clients who clearly have missed the point somewhere along the line about regular input is regular output, and almost need resetting on the basics before you can justify trialling everything else, because I think that's important as a nurse to make sure that we've tried everything first before we but equally not leaving it too long. Why suffer if someone's going to benefit so much from large volume irrigation? Why are we holding it for reserve?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there are clinics out there, and Michelle, we've been in this position and had this conversation before, but there are clinics out there that seem to keep hold of their patients for a good 12 to 18 months before they move on to the next treatment options.
I agree with that, Bridget. We do see that quite often. And I think it's interesting that you've described, both of you, although you're working with quite different patient groups, actually you're keen to bring it in earlier because you're saying these patients don't actually present until they've had symptoms for a very long time. So it kind of makes sense to offer a treatment that will hopefully work for some of them.
And I guess for some clinics, they're not quite sure, and understandably so, they're not quite sure when to introduce the next treatment option, and in particular, transanal irrigation. And I know, Michelle, we've talked about it quite a lot. The Bowel Interest Group, they, on their website, they have there's a pyramid treatment pathway, which has timelines in it, do you think having a pathway with timelines in, especially when it comes to introducing transanal irrigation, is of benefit?
I mean, it's useful to have timelines as a bit of a guide, but every patient's different. And for some patients, we need to get in there and bring them something that's going to help maybe a little bit sooner than we would with other patients who maybe need a bit more support before they move on to something like irrigation.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a very good point, isn't it, about the patients, they're complex. and there's no one treatment that's going to fit everyone, and it's a multimodal treatment. And Michelle, I know that you've worked with Rebecca in these clinics and just recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about having those treatments? It's not one individual treatment at a time. It's an approach that takes on one treatment and maybe another treatment at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all talk about having a toolbox, don't we? And we choose things in the toolbox. And I think both of you have both alluded to the fact that irrigation is great to bring it in, and often it's great to bring it in early, but you've also got to get the basics right.
Yes.
And I think you can be irrigating and improving things, but while you work on getting the other things right, as you said, Rebecca, about positioning and diet and those sorts of things. And I think, Jane, you picked up a good point about how sometimes patients forget or they get a bit lost.
Yes.
It's good to pick them up, isn't it? And
reset them almost.
And reset them, yeah.
Yes, I think that's quite a lot of my experience, actually. And equally, performing irrigation can work really well for a lot of our clients, but equally, it takes commitment.
Yes.
So I feel that we also have to be assessing, are they ready to take this on board at this point? Because if they're not, it's going to fail, and then you've got a failing conservative routine and a failing irrigation routine, and where we're going next.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant point, Jane. Looking at the psychological side, I think it's both physical and psychological that you have to look at when introducing any of these treatments. And going back to irrigation, how do you choose, because there's a lot of different irrigation systems out there, how do you choose to use, what type of irrigation would you use, and how do you choose to use that type of irrigation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes from experience of different patients.
Yes.
But the decision guide is really useful as well. It's given you a kind of a guide for when you might bring in different volumes of water and different regimes that you might use. For example, with a constipation patient, you would be looking at a higher volume of water. And that's just a bit of a feeling that you just know that you've had success with that before it's going to work.
Yeah, and I suppose from the decision guide, because you were part of writing the decision guide, weren't you, Michelle? It talks about high volume irrigation for slow transit constipation. Can you explain why we would use high volume irrigation for slow transit constipation?
Yeah, I think for slow transit, we realise, don't we, how long it takes for the stool to move around the colon. It can take many days. And I think in our experience with patients, we realise that high volume works much better. So you might get a bit of a flushing out action with the water, but also that higher volume can trigger some peristaltic action and help to move the stool around. So patients might not end up irrigating every day. Do you think, Rebecca?
Usually,
how often might they need to irrigate?
Every other day, maybe a couple of times a week, depending on their symptoms and how they're managing.
Would they do that to start with, or would they do it daily to start with?
Daily to start with.
And how long would it be?
It tends to be about 2 weeks. We would say do it every day.
Okay.
And then we would do a telephone assessment just to see how they're getting on, troubleshoot any problems, and then more often than not, the patient will either say, I'm getting on really well and I'm happy to keep doing it at this level, or it's been a bit more complex to fit into my daily life, and actually moving it to alternate days or a couple of times a week would be much better if I could get the same results with doing it. And
I think that's, again, another really good point, isn't it, about fitting in with somebody's everyday life. We kind of forget about that. And we're very prescriptive as nurses in saying, can you do it at this time and after breakfast? But actually, we do need to bear in mind what happens to these patients in everyday life, and the spinal cord injured patients as well. You know, I mean, they've got so many more things to deal with, not just bowel dysfunction. So when would you introduce irrigation with spinal cord injured patients? Would it be early doors? Would you give it a time factor, or is it very much on the individual person?
It's very much on the individual person. I have some patients in my experience that have waited decades before they've wanted to move on to something like irrigation. And I've had others that on their first admission, it's been clearly very appropriate for them to move on quicker. And then everyone else in between. So it really does depend on that client and what they're looking for. And it is fascinating, the sort of the psychological aspects of irrigation and how some people find it more acceptable than the digital interventions that very much form the part of the neurogenic bowel routines, but equally others who don't want another gadget in their bathroom, and you can never tell, and at what point we're going to introduce it. But what I do like about transanal irrigation is the fact that it can be used, over any age group, from sort of our 3-year-olds up to our very much maturer clients. And
very much so, yes, very much so. And that brings me on to Andy Jordan. She's a clinical nurse specialist in paediatrics at Addenbrooke's, and I know she very much introduces irrigation. She usually starts with low volume irrigation with her paediatrics, which kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And then moves up to high volume. So irrigation does cover functional bowels, neurogenic, paediatrics. So it really is a great treatment option, but we have to get it right. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you here, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we've looked at transanal irrigation and how it all began. We've looked at service audit and how that can help to introduce clinics and services. We've also looked at the different types of patients that irrigation is suited to. Now I would like to introduce you to our next guest, Professor Anton Emanuel from UCL. He talks to us about what the future could hold for high volume irrigation.
Yes, I mean, there's been a good deal of change in the 15 years we've had systems available to us. And that change is primarily related to the application of the technology rather than necessarily big changes in the technology, in my view. And what's become clear is when like any therapy, once it becomes embedded into clinical practice, two things emerge. One is the patient groups who aren't being treated, who in theory should from the research. The research says this treatment works for this patient group. Well, why does it work for all of them? So how do we help those patients we're missing? And then secondly, the other thing that emerges is the way in which technology changes. So if it's a drug, you get new variants in the drug, and with irrigation, you get improvements on it. So, and hopefully those two things coalesce. In other words, the improvements in technology that occur as part of scientific evolution overlap with the needs of patients. So I think what is clear is that irrigation has helped a discrete group of patients, and the science has told us that if you're lucky enough to be a responder, you seem to stay responsive and you don't accumulate side effects. So that's a great relief. We've got that 50 to 60% of patients who are treated, who respond, who seem to stay responsive in the long term, 12, 13 years into their treatment. So that's great. But what we also know is that there's a quarter to a third of patients who don't respond, and they can be picked up very, very early on. So in the first few months, we recognize the patients who we try, manipulate. So the future, I think, is in part, what improvements can we make to improve that pickup? So how, instead of having 30% drop off in the first 3 months, can we make it a smaller number? And is that by better patient selection? Well, that's not technology, but it is part of the evolution of the science of how do we as clinicians learn who not to offer this therapy to because it'll never work for them, rather than just saying all patients with condition X or Y. But the second part is where the technology comes into it, of saying, well, people are dropping out because they get problems with leakage, or problems with side effects, or problems with lack of response, or problems with non-compliance due to not getting any feedback. So I think the future will develop into saying, how do we understand initial treatment failures better to then keep people on? And part of that for me, in sort of the final bit of the future for me, is also then about developing things which are more bespoke. So in the same way that we wouldn't necessarily expect to have just one kind of acid suppressant for reflux, we shouldn't necessarily expect that there'll be one kind of irrigation system for all patients. And in fact, probably even more so than with drugs, because we're asking patients to go through a kind of a mental process of how they do something to their body, especially an intimate part of their body. So how do we make this thing look more personal, feel more like their system rather than this thing I have to do? And then how do we recognize that patients have different body shapes, different ways their toilets are accessed, different aspects of their underlying condition with their hand function or whatever else? How do we adapt technology to allow patients who could respond when we do it to them as healthcare professionals to do it themselves? So for me, those are the sort of broad areas, trying to understand initial treatment failures, trying to develop technology which helps people customize their irrigation, and trying to keep people who get on treatment longer if their condition progresses, so that they're able to maintain independence and quality of life.
I'd really like to thank all of our guests today. We've certainly had some great discussions, Michelle.
Oh, we really have, Bridget. I couldn't agree more. I particularly like what Lucy was talking about, the blurring of roles between professions. I think we can all learn from each other, and that's definitely a conversation to have in the future.
Yes, agree. I also really liked the experts that came in talking about complex patients and where high volume irrigation might be introduced.
And then, of course, Anton talked about what might happen in the future, where we might go.
And that certainly has given me food for thought for where we take our next project. Do you remember I said to you we have something very special, something very new to show you? Let's take a look.
And this is what happens when we take everything we know and everything we understand and combine it with what we search for and what we aim for. It's just when everything moves forward.
But when it comes down to it, to do what's right, it's all about simplicity. And not just in one area, but in our entire approach. And you can certainly see it in our innovative end result.
What if people had a more natural way of controlling their irrigation system, giving them even more freedom and comfort whenever they need it? You have to think anything's possible, right?
During the 10 years we have been on the market with the cone system, we got a lot of feedback on the system we already had. So this was the opportunity to think again, what would we do different with a new product? Yeah, it's a part of our DNA to talk to users. We don't want to do development without talking to users. So it's very important for us as engineers that we learn about the users, that we hear what the users are saying. And what's the gift for us is when they get the product and they are getting, yes, this helped my life, I have a new quality of life. You saved my life. That's the best we can hear. To be with healthcare professionals and talk to them is very important for us. They are a big part of the decision the users make. They get their products through a healthcare professional, which is important for us because otherwise they might use it wrong. So these healthcare professionals, the way they think, what they educate, how they educate, it's important for us to understand what their needs are as well. Of course, it's important for us when we talk to users that we understand their individual needs. So every person is different. So of course, what's good for you might not be good for the next one. So, and we want to make a system which fits more people. It's important to understand every single person, where is it important for you that the water bank is positioned when you irrigate? Where do you want to have the regulator? Or do you even want to regulate? And how do you make it intuitive? How do you make the product nice to look at as well? Because you want to store it afterwards. We want to make our product discreet as well.
The design ambition, besides the functional objectives, is very much about keeping it simple and fit into the context and the lifestyles of the users, no matter how active they might want to be. Putting ourselves in the place of the users to make it a very human product. What we also learned from the users is that they really much wanted to have control of the water flow, but also that each situation is unique and we need to have a solution that fit in every individual context that the users might have. So we really worked on how to make bowel irrigation more simple and to eliminate any hesitation the users might have in getting started with bowel irrigation. One of the very new and groundbreaking things about Flow is that it's able to stand. So now it has actually a dual positioning option. So you can either place it on the floor or you can hang it on your bathroom wall. So you have multiple options. When we talk to users, we heard that they needed to be in control of the whole irrigation procedure. And having a place and a way of packing the whole system back in the box in a nice and tidy way would really matter. So it's also to do with a practical approach for storage in between irrigation sessions. In a chaotic world in the last couple of years, we've really achieved a big thing here with new thinking, new technology, and a lot of new things brought together in Flow.
We took the complexity of the system away, so the user only have to think of how to use it, but they don't have to think about it because we took the complexity away from it. So all the technology behind it is actually hidden, so the users only have to think about the irrigation itself.
I actually remember the first time I saw the Flow cone. Real life, I saw these 5 water outlets, and you really have water coming out from all 5 outlets. So you have this multi-directional effect. I mean, I've never seen that before in a cone.
I think it's incredible as well, the way your teams designed the cone with that you had the soft part on top also for comfort, and that it's with a tapered shape that you get that stability that you need further down. So then when you have the tube connected in, that you really have this stable hold. You also have the comfort, and of course with the hydrophilic coating as well for that smooth irrigation feeling of smooth in and out. I think it's really incredible how much that Flow cone is packed with thinking.
And I mean, imagine all the possibilities you now have. I mean, you can use the water bag in anywhere between shoulder height and the floor. So if you are out traveling or in another bathroom environment that you don't know before, you can just place it on a table or something else, and then you have your water flow really easy. And just the fact that you can operate your water flow regulator with one hand means that you have the other hand free.
Yeah, I think that's so important that we help this feeling of control, because for so long you can not have that feeling of control and not have control of your bowels. And then also to learn a whole new treatment and a whole new routines to bring into your daily life, if through the product that we can help not only with the outcome of irrigation, but also through use of the product to feel in control. And yes, I can be comfortable handling this product. Yeah. It's amazing.
What we really want is the users to live the life that they want to. So yeah, I think that all helps.
And that's definitely the core of what we're doing. We have looked into what are the user needs and then built the product around that.
Having chronic constipation for well over 10 years has been absolutely awful, because I've been in and out of hospital. Yeah, it's been pretty hard going with the whole situation really. I mean, with EDS there's a lot that goes on, and it is a connective tissue disorder. So basically my bowel tissue is so slack that it's not actually pushing along the feces, which is really hard to deal with by yourself, because how can you get that going unless it's going to be something like an intervention basically. So the Q4 was like my little lifeline. As soon as that got brought into the equation, it was like, wow, I've actually got something that can keep me living really. Being that I use the Q4 Irricido cone system, and that being my lifeline, I've used it for about 3 or 4 years, so I'm pretty good at using it now to as quick as possible. But I was also asked to use a new product. So yeah, when I opened the box I was like, wow, this looks really, really like someone who uses the Q4 has really thought there's a few things that need to be addressed to make it as manageable as possible. I think for me the best part of the new system is definitely the hand press and being able to control it one-handed, because it can all feel a bit like fingers and thumbs sometimes when you're trying to do it all and irrigate at the same time and all of that. So having a product that's easier and just one-handed, it's a bit like you can kind of get to grips with holding and pushing in the water yourself, rather than feeling like, oh my God, you know, I've got to try and now do that, and now do that. It's literally like as easy as pie, you know. So that was, I think that's definitely the main thing that jumped into my lap, was like, that is brilliant. It's changed how I can go about life, because at one point I was in and out of hospital being very, very poorly, and not able to be as confident as I am. Having something that can actually help with your life is just, it's just life-changing completely. And well, knowledge is power, and you know, if you can get help and support, and there's products out there that are gonna actually change how you live life, it's a different life, isn't it? It's an impact that's just brilliant.
I love the cones. They're really straightforward to use and so smooth. There's no sharpness whatsoever. I found it very easy and comfortable to use. The cones are lubricated just right. They slip in and out very easily, and I had no problem holding onto the pump either. The pumping action is really easy. I also felt the water flow was very good. I could feel it going in. The bag was very easy to fill and empty, and the cap opened easily and felt really secure. The cone snapped on securely as well. Overall, I think the product is excellent.
Wow.
I know. We are genuinely really proud to share this new product with you so that we can make a big difference to so many patients' lives. I'd like to thank all of our guest speakers today and to everyone that contributed to this fabulous webinar. We really are very proud of this product and the difference it's going to make to people's lives.
What if people had a more natural way of controlling their irrigation system?
The possibilities were unlimited to the beginning. I thought this was the treatment of truth for every functional bowel patient.
We took the complexity of the system away, so the user only have to think of how to use it, but they don't have to think about it because we took the complexity away from it. So all the technology behind it is actually hidden, so the users only have to think about the irrigation itself.
But equally, not leaving it too long. Why suffer if someone's going to benefit so much from large volume irrigation? Why are we holding it for in reserve?
So this product has come along and changed my life. So what would you rather, still be suffering or use something that's a little bit different to anyone else, but be like everyone else?